also just want to comment. I love seeing everybody introducing themselves on our Meetup channel. Got people calling in from Sweden and Germany and Spain and Chelan, Washington, which is near where I live. Well, welcome everyone to Semgrep Spring 2022 Meetup. We're super thrilled that you could join us today. As I just posted in the chat, this is where we're going to be having our discussions on our community Slack Meetup channel. If you got your phone, you can scan that QR code, or you can just type go.r2c.dev/meetup. We've got a whole bunch of R2C folks on there, including these 4 excellent moderators. And that it's also a great way to chat with your fellow attendees. You may be wondering, who is this person that is talking to you? My name is Emily Fortuna. I'm R2C's new developer advocate. I am here to help make Semgrep easier to understand and use, and also advocate your needs and feature requests and challenges back to the engineering team. I worked as a software engineer for a bunch of years at Google on a couple different teams, including working on compiler engineering as well as programming language design. And then I was a developer advocate on the Flutter team. If you showed up to this meeting because someone just told you this is the place to be this morning, they are right. And if you're wondering though, what is Semgrep? Semgrep is a lightweight tool for security engineers and their developers to catch security vulnerabilities before shipping your code. It works in a bunch of different languages, or we support a whole bunch of different languages. And one of the key wins of using Semgrep is just how configurable it is, because nobody wants to waste their time with a bunch of false positives of potential security vulnerabilities that aren't actually so. And with Semgrep, you can configure those rules to be specific to your code base so that the security vulnerabilities that are found are much more likely to actually be bugs that you need to fix. And lastly, working with Semgrep, scans are super fast, and also making changes to those rules is super fast. So you've got a nice development time. It's a nice iteration cycle with that as well. So here is what we'll be covering today. First, Clint will be talking about security industry trends. Then we're going to hear from a number of PMs and software engineers on new things with Semgrep that you can use either today or soon. And then we're going to hear from 2 excellent community members who have written tools to work with Semgrep. And then lastly, Isaac, our CEO, will be following up with what's to come in the future. So I'm going to first hand it over to Clint, who is the head of security research at R2C, and he'll be talking about industry trends.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. It's great to see you. And thank you, Emily, for the introduction. Yeah, as discussed, we're going to talk a little bit about some high-level security trends that I've seen across many different security teams at a number of companies, and hopefully provides some useful framing for just how you think about where we've been, where we're headed, and maybe about how to think about security within your company. Next slide, please. There's many things to talk about. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time today, so I just chose 3 things in particular. So one, to sort of zoom out and think, how is the industry changing over time? Specifically, like how is the relationship between engineering teams and security teams changing? Like how are things shifting there responsibility-wise and maybe perception of each other? We'll talk a little bit about a shift from a focus on finding vulnerabilities to secure defaults, and how can we sort of eliminate classes of issues rather than sort of play bug whack-a-mole. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about developer experience and how important that is in security. Next slide, please. Okay, so to sort of take a look back historically and even zoom out, not just security, but just tech in general, there's been a lot of big changes over the past, say, 10 or 20 years, right? From a more waterfall development process, which tend to be a bit slower, to more agile, where we're releasing software more quickly. Many companies are now shipping to production multiple times a day even. There used to be a separation between sort of dev and ops teams, but now there's been sort of a collapsing into DevOps teams. And much software used to be run sort of on-prem on company hardware, perhaps in your own data center, but now there's this big adoption of the cloud. Next. So those are sort of like tech trends, but if we look at like sort of security, similar to how there used to be sort of these separate dev and ops teams, and now there's this been merging about DevOps. I think there's been almost a similar thing in some cases with engineering and security, which used to be very separate, distinct teams that maybe didn't even communicate that often. And when so, it was kind of adversarial maybe, to more like security engineering. So, security professionals writing software and trying to influence the software development process, and also just like sort of working more closely. And then again, a shift from finding vulnerabilities to secure default. So we're going to get into both of those a bit more in a second. Next slide. So if you ask 20 different security people, they'll probably give you 24 different answers about what is sort of like historical, traditional versus modern, but this is my opinion. So I think traditionally, security teams were quite separate from engineering orgs. They may not have even known many people on engineering teams, and there wasn't necessarily a close relationship there. But I think in a number of companies, like friends of mine who are on AppSec or ProdSec teams, at many companies are like, we try to build security champions on engineering teams, like developers who are very passionate about security. They're trying to work closely, maybe even on engineering roadmaps to try to get sort of security primitives in there. And again, previously there was maybe some antagonism where the security team was like, this is just how things should be done, without necessarily a knowledge of SDLC processes or how software was written. But now I see a lot more like, how do we share goals together? Like, not just engineering goals and security goals, but sort of like defining roadmaps together and almost having a customer service mindset where the customer is developers. How can we enable our customers to do their job better, faster, and more securely? Traditionally, security professionals didn't necessarily read code. They may not have had an engineering background. They just sort of ran security tools and threw whatever it found over the fence and say like, this is your problem now, without necessarily understanding, what is the actual risk, what's the priority here, and maybe couldn't help developers actually fix it. But I see a lot of teams now, promisingly, where security professionals are very comfortable reading and even writing code, right? So the engineering part of security engineering. Previously, there was a focus on like, how do we fix all the vulnerabilities? It doesn't matter how low severity or whether it's on some like internal microservice that's never exposed to the internet, like you just have to fix everything. But I think now there's a much more, reasoned view of like, okay, well, yes, we should fix critical and high risk issues, but also ultimately the business needs to ship features quickly, right? This is like how we stay in business, is by advancing the product and serving our customers. So let's move quickly and minimize risk. And then again, sort of one-off vulnerability finding, sort of like a whack-a-mole, let's try to find all the things, to taking a more strategic approach, like how can we engineer either processes or frameworks or systems such that we can prevent entire classes of vulnerabilities from happening in the first place, so we don't have to do the whack-a-mole via secure defaults. So there's been a lot of work in, or a lot of like talks and blog posts about like this sort of strategic shift between how engineering and security teams work together and what sort of the focus of security teams are now. Two example talks that I like a lot. One is the end of the AppSec team, a sort of ominous title, but it's actually very sort of like positive and friendly, by Justin Collins, the author of Brakeman. And then dumping traditional security teams, besides SF keynote by Flea. I think both are go into these things in much more detail than I can here. Yeah, both Justin and Flea are at Gusto. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the shift to secure defaults. Next slide. So I have a lot of thoughts in this space. Unfortunately, I don't have much time to talk about it, so I'm just going to make sort of an intuitive argument to you quickly. So if you think about what we're trying to accomplish as security professionals, we're trying to reduce risk. And so if on the left-hand side, the axis here is sort of the effort required in CHUs, which is Clint's hand-wavy units. So if you think like simplistically, if you build like a secure way to say parse XML, understanding if a developer is like using or not using that is pretty easy, right? You can just sort of grep for whatever function is being called. One might even say like semgrep for it. But if you want to find if there's a potential bug, you need to reason about, is user input flowing here to confirm if it's a real bug. You probably need to do even additional work and then writing a proof of concept exploit that proves that something is actually not just vulnerable, but exploitable in practice. Like that's even more work, right? So ultimately our goal here is to reduce risk and improve the security posture of our system. So like, why do the really hard thing if you can get the same security value and risk mitigation of doing like this simpler thing? Next slide. And fundamentally, I think my argument is detecting the use or lack of use of secure defaults is just much easier than finding bugs. Next slide. Don't just take my word for it. I have a number of examples, but I'll just show one here. So this was a great talk by Scott and Isha of Netflix at AppSec Cali a few years ago. And this slide is basically like, where are we focusing our security program as like a Netflix AppSec team? And notice how secure by default is one of the core things they're focusing on and how that is only increasing over time in sort of priority. Next slide. So if you want, instead of just a few minutes on this idea, but would rather have like an entire talk, Isaac and I gave a global AppSec SF talk a few years ago, and you can check out the slides there. So it also gives examples from like Facebook and Microsoft and Google and like other things as well as like a methodology for actually doing this in practice in your company. So if you like this topic, feel free to check that out. Next slide. Okay, so wrapping up with developer experience. Next slide. So this is, I think, sort of continuing the theme of secure defaults and guardrails. Like, basically, if you put yourself in your colleagues' shoes in engineering, if there's something that they need to be very like aware of security to do, for example, crypto or parsing XML, or maybe authentication or authorization, or maybe, I don't know, mutual TLS between services. Like if there's something they have to keep a lot of security context in their head in order to do it, just if possible, build a secure by default way and just have everyone do that. Ideally, security is somewhat orthogonal to developers shipping new features as much as possible, that is. One quote I really like from Asta at Netflix is, hitch your security wagon to developer productivity. Right, so how can we make the secure version have an even better developer user experience than the old way? And one way to do that is by adding telemetry or logging or some other valuable features into the primitives you're providing developers that gives them something that they want. And oh, by the way, it's secure too. Pro tip that I like is to integrate security at the right points. So for example, if there's a new project starter template that everyone forks to create a new microservice in your company, if you put whatever sort of security settings or tooling or features into that, and then everyone who forks that is just going to get these sort of security wins out of the box without you needing to convince them to do it. So you're getting sort of automatic widespread adoption without really doing anything. Okay, next slide. So just to sort of wrap up, there's tons of people writing about sort of developer experience. I just wanted to include a few quick examples. So one, developer experience is security by Rachel Stevens. So again, we're increasingly sort of shifting responsibility to developers to build secure apps, which given that they're the ones building in the first place, is like a big ask in my opinion. So how can we make it as frictionless as possible for them to do that? And again, a prime way to do that is to put these secure defaults into platforms and software. A quote I really, really like is by Avi Douglin: security at the expense of usability comes at the expense of security, right? So if we are introducing security, but in a way that causes a lot of friction, that makes people do their job worse or maybe even take longer, ultimately this is going to negatively impact security. And then there's like a roundup of a bunch of links by James Governor there if you want to check those out as well. Next slide. So if scaling security is a topic you find very interesting, I gave a B-Sides SF talk a bit ago about, I think collecting, I don't know, like 50 to 100 different talks and blog posts and tools from many different companies and sort of coalescing it into one space. So feel free to check that out if you'd like. Next slide. Yeah, it took me like hundreds of hours to make that talk, so feel free to save yourself some time. Okay, so just quickly to wrap up. Yeah, so we see a lot of historical shifts similar to sort of dev and ops teams becoming DevOps. I think there's a similar sort of coalescing of security professionals supporting engineering teams, and this like greater sort of rapport and sort of shared milestones and goals. There's a shift from finding vulnerabilities to secure defaults or guardrails or paved road, depending on who you're talking to. And then finally, I think there is more awareness amongst security professionals about how do we build things that are both secure, but have a very excellent developer user experience as well. Not just like, they have to use it because I say so, but how can we make it a joy to use? Yeah, so that's all the time I have. I think there'll be time for questions at the end of the whole presentation. But yeah, thanks for your time and attention, and back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Clint. That was fantastic and a really great overview. I appreciate it. Next up, we've got Raghav, who is a product manager for findings, program analysis, and security research. And he's going to be talking about some of the new things you can find in Semgrep app. Send it over to you,
cool.
Raghav.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, my fun fact was that I was an extra in a movie, but I realized that after I present at this meetup, I can go ahead and change that to presenting at a Semgrep meetup, because that'll be the closest I've been to fame. So I'm looking forward to getting this presentation done and going and updating that slide. Let me get started. So I'm going to talk about two, I think, big kind of features today. The first, both are very developer centric. The first will be Autofix, and the second will be kind of this, it's less of a feature and more of kind of a movement we're trying to build, which is just closing the security developer feedback loop and talking about developer feedback and the importance of, connecting with, for us as a company and building this product, connecting with developers as our end user, but then also empowering security individuals to go and do the same thing. So I'm going to do a live demo actually for both of these. So bear with me. I'm going to touch on Autofix first. Emily, can you confirm that I changed my screen appropriately? You're seeing the editor? Perfect. Yes. So this is a rule that I picked from our registry. On the left, you can kind of see the rule pattern. This is the file path clean misuse rule. And everything looks good, except there's one little thing in this rule that is different than what a lot of rules have in the registry, which is this line about fix. And so this is what we kind of, this is our syntax for being able to create quote unquote autofix as part of Semgrep rules. And what it is it's saying, hey, if we find something, the pattern matches something. So on the right, we can run the rule and see, okay, we're going to find two things. If we find either of these two things, we want to basically replace this vulnerable code or this bad code with whatever this fix pattern is. Now, it looks great in the editor, but where it really shines, I think, when you're working with developers and integrating into the developer workflow in CI, you can see how this kind of comes out. So we have a PR, which has this, vulnerable code. And traditionally, we would kind of leave a comment in the PR that would say, this is the rule message, and this is the issue with this finding. But then the onus would be on the developer to go and understand, hey, if the rule message isn't great, how do I fix it? Often, if the rule message isn't great, the developer won't really worry about fixing it because it's too much of a headache or burden to do that. And unless it's a blocking rule, it kind of just gets glossed over. But now you see that with Autofix, we're able to suggest basically what this change should be. And in its most basic form here, right, it's just replacing call to the function clean with some more information to kind of make it a more secure call. But this is kind of a, I guess, MVP of sorts, because this becomes really powerful when you begin to look into what's possible with multi-line autofix and addressing more complicated vulnerabilities. And you really now make it really, really easy for the developer to go ahead and make these changes and secure their code in a kind of a, 2-click process here. It's, I see this, I agree with it, I can go ahead and I can come with the changes right away. And it's very easy to do that. And then in the next scan, Semgrep will say, great, this finding is resolved, no need to worry about it. And the developer experience there is much better. And we're getting one step closer to kind of truly shifting left. The main goals here were, to provide actionable steps for surface findings. So it's one thing to actually surface the finding, but then the question always comes, what's next? And for developers, we don't want to slow down their product velocity, their development speed. We're most interested in providing them with the best experience possible and making them partners for the security team, so that security is something they think about as, not just this kind of added pressure that goes into their development workflow, but something that they can also contribute to and improve the security posture of their organization. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is, I think, something I'm personally very excited about, and I'll go into a little bit about why, but is developer feedback. And I'm going to go into a kind of a demo for this as well. So if we go back to this editor, we can walk through the journey of, there's a couple different people I think this really touches. So if we think about a rule author, I've gone and I've written this rule, and now I've shared it with the Semgrep community, whether it's via the registry, or maybe I'm working in an organization where I have my own private rules and I'm running something specific to my org. I write this rule, but it's traditionally been very difficult for me to get feedback on how this rule is performing. I don't know if it's catching a lot of true positives, a lot of false positives. Maybe the message isn't clear. Maybe the autofix suggestion I've provided isn't clear. But it's kind of like, once it's out there in the world, it's very hard for me to understand and iterate on what I've created. And this is kind of similar to security teams when they're working in organizations with hundreds of developers. One security engineer for 100+ developers, they may start running a bunch of rules, but then they don't get feedback into how these rules are actually performing in CI and in the developer workflow. And really, when they get the feedback is when developers ultimately completely push back against the tool and say, hey, we really don't want to be using this. It's too much noise. These rules are bad. There's nothing we can do. And at that point, the damage has been done. The political capital has been burned. And it's really hard to make, recover from that. And we're really aiming with Semgrep to kind of build this culture of collaboration with security teams, with rule writers, and the end user or consumer of the output. So in practice, how does this work? Well, I write this rule. I add it as a security engineer. I add it to my CI workflow. And I'm going to go back to the same example here. I'm a developer. I'm reading this and I see, okay, cool. I see, there's this autofix suggestion. It looks great, but I'm still not really sure if this is a security vulnerability or maybe I have some other feedback to give. The great thing now is you can just click not helpful. And this is the point of connection between security engineer and developer. You click not helpful, you're taken to a page where you're able to kind of give information on why it was not helpful. And this textual information is kind of the most important part. This is where developers can really share why things aren't working, whether it's because it's a false positive, the message was unhelpful, the rule is too noisy. And then this information can be then fed back to us as a company. And so we can improve rules in the registry for rules we write, but then also be taken to security teams to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't run this rule in blocking mode, or maybe you shouldn't run this rule at all because it's very, very noisy and it impacts developer experience. Or take it to the original rule author and say, hey, these are the 10 things that developers are saying about your rule. This is kind of great information, and then they can go ahead, fix it, update it in the registry, and then it becomes better for the entire community. So here I want to say, autofix suggestion is not helpful. Very easy for me to go submit this comment. We record the feedback, and then in one click, you're able to go back to GitHub and continue on your development workflow. One piece of feedback we kind of get quite often is that, why do you take us away from this page? We want to stay within GitHub and, or at least open the feedback in a new tab. This is a kind of a minor nit with GitHub, is we're not able to open Markdown links in a new tab, and that's why we kind of have to take developers away from the flow a little bit and then bring them back. But the goal really is ultimately to make it really easy for developers to give this feedback and interact with rule authors and their security teams. And then if we come to Semgrep app, you can see that, if I refresh my page, here we have our section of in our dashboard rules. And you can see in the most disliked section, you can see hey, this rule has, been disliked 4 times. There's only 50% fix rate. And one was because one of the two is I just did the autofix. But this gives really good signal for security teams that are maybe running 100, 200, 300 rules, that they can quickly see which rules are not working and very quickly eliminate them from workflows while they figure out the best way forward to preserve the rule, improve the rule, or work with the developers on what to do next. So the goals here, I think we want to build trust between security teams and developers. We often hear that there's limited, I mentioned this before, but limited, I guess, like political capital, and the trust is really low with security teams and developers based on older security trends. And with Semgrep, the goal is we want to foster a really healthy collaborative relationship there. And since putting this feature out, we've seen that there's been a really good relationship building opportunity for organizations that are leveraging this developer feedback, and developers are able to then engage with security engineers. And we also want to create network effects within our Semgrep community. And so what I mean by this is, if somebody writes a rule and they get feedback on it, they're able to go ahead and improve that rule, not for just that one user, but then for the entire community. And as the community grows, we're able to then have more developers giving feedback on more and more rules, which benefits rule writers, security engineers, and really as the community grows, this kind of feedback loop of rule writing, rule feedback is much tighter and much more powerful. So this is an example of a real world example. We had this detected username and password and URI rule. And the feedback we got from this was, hey, this is a false positive. I'm interpolating the password into the URL, so it's not in the source code. And within 8 hours of receiving this feedback, we were able to make changes to this rule and update it into the registry for everyone to use. And this is just one example of several that we've had in the past just even week where this has happened. And I think this is really first, the ease of writing rules in Semgrep makes taking action on this feedback much easier. So in less than a day, going from, hey, this is what's wrong with the rule, how can we fix it, to actually having the fix out in the world for people to use has been extremely valuable. And I think as the community grows and as we continue to kind of focus more on this, it'll become even more exciting to see kind of where developer feedback as a whole goes. So some of the challenges we've had, when we started with this, we were getting a lot of noisy data. We gave developers the option to choose between several different kind of types of feedback. So they could say a rule was bad, they could say a rule was confusing, a finding was confusing, they could say a finding was good. But what we kind of gathered from that was there wasn't really any clear signal from the data. You would have a particular finding be marked as good 5 times, bad 5 times, and confusing 5 times. And so it became really hard to take any actionable steps there. We weren't really clear how to proceed. And so kind of what we've done is we've kind of given one option to say, hey, this finding is not useful. And if it's not useful, there's ability to provide additional context in the form of just text, which has been much better in terms of getting good feedback and information here. The next is general improvements versus org-specific improvements. So when feedback is left, it kind of fits into 2 categories. It's either general feedback for the rule, but sometimes it's feedback that is specific to an organization because the way they write their code or the way they enforce different security standards is done a little bit differently. So you might be using a function that traditionally is not the best, but in an organization, there are other checks in place to make sure that it's completely fine to use. And so really like separating out what is an organization-specific improvement versus a general registry improvement, and how can we enable companies to kind of understand this and make changes at the security team level for their developers. And the last is kind of what I talked about, is how can we empower the community to fix rules? And so this is not just collecting the data and knowing which rules are bad, but also then how can we output this back to security teams, to rule authors, and to the broader community and say, hey, this is the feedback we've gotten. Like, we want to give you all the tools at your disposal to know exactly what's wrong with the rules that are currently out there, and then being able to go ahead and fix it and improve it for the entire community. I'm super excited about this. I think general motion to be closer to the developer as our end user and kind of really from their perspective see how we can improve their workflow. It's something that in my past job, I was a software engineer, and when it came to security, this was kind of a notion that I had, was that it's kind of a way to slow down the development process, and it kind of everything is just thrown at you at the end of a quarter, a sprint, etc. But this like real-time, like shift left mentality is really exciting. And I think developer feedback and Autofix are really crucial kind of pillars for that. So that's all I have. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer in the Slack channel. I'll be watching there, or my email is raghav@r2c.dev. So any questions about either of these two, please feel free to send me a message.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Raghav. That was great. Oh, hold on. Am I sharing what I think I'm sharing? There we go. Is everyone seeing my screen with Milan on top? Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Raghav. That was super exciting. I'm really excited that like this is coming down the pipeline and can again further improve the developer and security engineer or team relationship. Next up, we've got Milan, who is also a product manager, and she's product manager for our rule writing team at R2C, and she'll be talking about the new editor.
Yes, that's me. Hi, everyone. I'm Milan, and I think about all things related to custom rules here at R2C. And before I get started talking about the editor, I'd like to do a quick poll, and it should be flashing on your screen now, where you can vote if you've ever written a custom rule with Semgrep. So I'll give folks a few seconds to do that. Vote yes, no, maybe so. And if you haven't, for any reason, if you click no, send me a ping on Slack. I'd be happy to walk you through it for your first time. And even if you have written a custom rule already, message me anyway. I'd be love to share with you some tips to help you write it faster or easier the next time you write your next rule. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the new editor. And the new editor is a powerful tool to help you create, test, and share your Semgrep rules. If you've used Semgrep before and written a custom rule, you've likely managed or written it in the playground or using the CLI. However, we've heard from users that both of these ways can be difficult to collaborate on those rules when you're trying to share it with different stakeholders, get feedback, and it can really lead to a lot of back and forth. And so if we go to the next slide, I'll show you what the new editor looks like. And the editor is really our answer to some of these concerns. In the editor, as you can see here, you can run rules, see all the matches on your test code, and see how precise the rule that you wrote is at catching your test cases. The editor provides more information about how a rule is performing, thereby hoping to reduce the number of false positives you see on your custom rules. If I take a quick look at what's happening on this screen, right in the middle here, we've got our Semgrep rule right in the center. On the right side, you've got your test code and the matches displaying at the bottom. And on the left, you can see your library, which stores all of the rules that are part of your organization, and the Semgrep registry, where you can see all of the rules that Semgrep community has wonderfully written. And similarly, if we advance a bit, we've also heard from users that it can be hard to come up with ideas for new Semgrep rules, especially when they're first starting out. But now users don't need to write rules from scratch. The editor allows you to easily leverage the database of rules that we have in the registry to fork or copy an existing rule from the registry, make some tweaks, customize it to your organization, and quickly add it to your repository and add it to your rule board, all within the same place. And if we go to the last thing that I wanted to mention, for any fans of taint mode out here, taint mode is also supported in the editor. You can define a source, a sink, and a sanitizer function and write rules to track untrusted data throughout a program as well. If you're interested in anything of what you've seen here about the editor, you can log in to semgrep.dev on the next slide, scan the QR code, and see what the editor looks like. So thank you all so much. And again, if you have any questions, want to write your first custom rule, send up a flare in the Meetup channel, and I'd be happy to walk you through it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Milan. That was great. And yeah, we also have another poll coming up on how you use taint mode. I believe that should be coming. There we go. But yes, we are eager to get more rule writing and help you make that happen. So next up, we have Iago, and you'll find out a little more why we were doing that poll. he's a program analysis engineer, and he's going to be talking about Semgrep dataflow. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen because Iago is going to be doing his own demo.
Okay, so let me. Just an FYI, I think you muted.
Iago, you are muted.
Okay, sorry. This is a problem with. I know what it is. 1 second. You hear me now, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we can
Right?
hear you now.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So, yeah, I will be talking about the data flow powers of Semgrep. Basically, I will cover 2 features. One that is relatively new, released like 1 or 2 months ago, which is called symbolic propagation. And the other one is stain mode, which has been around for a little while. So, yeah, please answer the poll if you have time. And I would like to know. I would really like to know who is using stain mode, and if you have any feedback on it, just I would love to hear as well. So one of these data flow powers of Semgrep is the ability to do AST matching enriched by data flow analysis. So that's what powers the constant propagation feature, for instance. I guess most of you will be familiar with this. So here is a small graph that shows a simplified version of how Semgrep works. So the code goes through the parser, produces an AST. This goes through the matcher, which takes the AST and the security checks and produces a bunch of findings. So how the matcher, if it is based on ASTs, can match modulo constants. Well, that's because we have here the data flow engine, which is taking the AST and then annotating it with constant information. So for instance, it may tell us that some variable X here in this return statement is known to have the constant value of 42. So related to constants, I wanted to tell you a bit more about symbolic propagation, because it's basically a generalization of constant propagation where we not only propagate constants, but also expressions. And a bit to explain also why we need it. So if you look at the right, we have this code, this function with return x. We know that x is equals to 42. That allows Semgrep to match return 42 against this code. That works well. It allows us to write a simple pattern and match equivalent code. That's also why we call Semgrep, because it's semantic grep, right? Now, if we go with a slightly more complex example, a function that takes an object, calls foo on the object, stores the result in x, then calls bar on x, and we want to do a similar thing. We want to write a pattern that just ignores this intermediate assignment. Well, this doesn't work. Semgrep doesn't know or use not to know about this. And the alternative is to write the pattern either, right? You could specify the different ways to write this piece of code, right? X.foo.bar or y equals to x.foo and then y.bar. And that works in our example, but if the rule is complex, then you end up with very large rules. Here, I really tried to zoom out and I still couldn't fit it in the screen. It's like 500 lines of a pattern formula. So that's really difficult to maintain and is not really nice. So some releases ago, we implemented symbolic propagation, solving this problem. It works. You can see here, we can write this pattern. It matches the code that we expected. By the way, there is a blog post that you can read if you want the longer version. There's only one detail. This is, for now, an experimental feature, disabled by default, so you need to enable explicitly. We would like to be the default, but we want to be sure that it's ready for that. So there are no bugs and no surprises. So for now, is you need to enable. And if we get back to the previous example with this huge rule, if we rewrite it with symbolic propagation, we get a 10 times reduction in the size, which is pretty neat. And now I would like to go with the second power, which is to actually run data flow power analysis like other SaaS tools. And the prime example of it is Jain mode. So here we have a Jain mode rule. We just specify this mode and we write pattern sources. So here is just a piece of code that gets some cookies, some data from cookies, and we consider this untrusted data. And we want to make sure that this untrusted data doesn't get into pickle.loads, which can lead to arbitrary code execution. So it's our sink. And this works using the same pieces as before, but organizing a slightly different way. So the code here goes to the parser again, there's the AST, but what produces the findings now is not the matcher, is the data flow engine. And we use the matcher to annotate the AST. So we take the sources and we pass them through the matcher, and the matcher tells us, oh, this node over here is a source. We take the sinks, we pass it to the matcher, and it tells us, oh, this node over here is a sink. And with that, the data flow engine does the magic. So why we need it? So let's say we are writing some Flask application, and we want to prevent code like this one, where you take the data from the cookies, code it, build some binary string, and we responsibly send it directly to pickle loads. So what can we do about it? So traditionally, or ideally, in Semgrep, we would like to write this kind of rule, very, very simple rule. Just find any use of pickle loads such that the argument is not a constant string. And that should work ideally in ideal code bases, I guess. But in practice, often leads to a lot of false positives for several reasons. But one, of course, is that the constant propagation in Semgrep is not perfect. It cannot detect all the cases. But it can also be that it's not a constant, but you have took some steps to guarantee that the data has been sanitized, has been checked, so it's safe to pass to pickle loads. So another approach which R2C used to use in the registry is to basically take this piece of code, copy it into a rule, just change some code with ellipses, change variables by meta variables, and then we get a rule that basically finds this code or the slight variations of it. And this works pretty well. The only problem is that it misses many things. So basically it misses any code that doesn't look very much like this. And if you want to cover more cases, then you need to start adding pattern hiders, enumerating all the cases and such, right? Besides these ellipses, some people may think that follows the control flow, but it does not. Ellipses just follows the tree structure. So it's not really equivalent. So how the Jain mode works, just to put it together, we have this code, this rule. So first step, we look at the sources and we try to match them against the code, and we see that this is a source. It matches our pattern sources. Okay, fine. Now we take the pattern sinks, we match it against the code, and we see this is a sink. And then all this is passed to the data flow engine, and which finds this trace that goes from the source to the sink and reports the sink because it received untrusted data. And the magic here, I think, is that in pattern sources or pattern sinks, you can actually write any arbitrary pattern. You can really express anything you want, or almost anything you want. So again, we have a very big reduction in the size of the rules. So this is one of the rules we used to have in the registry, is in search mode, and this is the equivalent rule written in Jain mode. So it also offers this. So besides less false positives and less false negatives, it should also help with maintainability of the rules. And there is also a blog post you can read if you want to get the longer version. Yeah, and that's all from me. So please ask any questions you may have in the Slack or email me or whatever suits you. And thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Iago. That was super awesome and super informative and super exciting. Much shorter rules. It's fantastic. Let me pull up my screen again. Next, we'll be hearing from a couple of our excellent community members. First up, we'll hear from Lewis Ardern, who is the head security engineer at Salesforce. Lewis, I'll turn
Actually,
was that
Emily,
actually, oh, go ahead.
Oh, yes?
would it be okay if Natan goes first?
Oh, of course. So Natan Yellin, CEO of Robusta.dev.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, and apologies for the scheduling constraints. Just a busy day. So what I'll be showing is a small tool that I wrote, which essentially uses for Semgrep for something totally different, not security related. Here I have Jupyter Notebook, which is a popular way of running different machine learning experiments and running interactive Python code. And what I did is I essentially hooked up Semgrep so I can run semantic analysis on the code that I'm running in Jupyter Notebook. And then I can correlate that with performance issues and see how long it took for code to run. And then I can give recommendations for how to make your code run faster. So I'm just going to let this run and then I'll walk you through what's going on. So I'm taking some arbitrary Python code and I'm just running that now in Jupyter Notebook. Now in the background, two things are happening. First, this code is running and it's getting CPU profiled to see what are the hotspots in the code that are taking up live time. And second, I'm running Semgrep on this code and I'm looking for certain specific patterns which identify opportunities to improve the performance of the code. And this is a plugin that you can install on any Jupyter Notebook. So here this code finished running. So what you can see now is you can essentially see two different things here. First, this line of code took 7 seconds to run. So we're marking it as red and it's color coded. So the more, so if there was a code here that ran very fast, then you would see in a slightly different color compared to this. Everything else here isn't even getting marked up because it was fairly fast. And second, I can see here, this took the most time to run, but over here, there's also a recommendation. So this sort of analysis, just with the colors and color coding that, is the type of analysis that you can do with any CPU profiler. You're an extension for Jupyter Notebook to make that more convenient. And then what we're doing here, though, where we're showing the recommendation, this is based on a Semgrep rule. There's a Semgrep rule that identifies that you have here a call to Jason .dumps, and it knows that there's a way to optimize this code. And if you just had a call here, Jason.dumps for something which didn't take a live time, then we actually wouldn't even show this hint at all. We're only showing you on places that both have a performance issue and where we have a Semgrep result that lets us optimize this code. And one of the things I personally love about Semgrep, and I don't actually deal with the security space at all when I'm not doing stuff like this. I work on Kubernetes monitoring and open source solutions for that. But one of the things that I love about Semgrep, and that I think really makes it an exceptional tool in the security space, is that you can also apply fixes. So we can take that, which was feature originally built for security, and we can apply it here as well to performance improvements and to automatic performance improvements. So I'm just going to hit here, apply and rerun. And now behind the scenes, we're running Semgrep a second time, this time in fix mode. And this is now fixing the code, and it changed it. So it changed that line and it replaced the use of a standard JSON function with the OR JSON library. And it's now rerunning this code. And this will be done in just a moment. And then I'll be able to see if we improve the performance. So I can see this line is no longer as performance heavy. And we actually improved the code there, and we improved the speed by 44%. And it was 44% faster. And what's going on under the hood is we're just running the CPU profiler, and then we're correlating those results with Semgrep rules like this rule that are focused on performance and that can tell you where there are performance improvements. So this is all open source. We have a blog post about this on our website. Let's see if I can find that. If you go robusta.dev and you can head over to the blog, we have a blog post that goes into this in live details, why we wrote this and why it's interesting and why we love Semgrep so much. So thank you.
Thanks, Natan. That was awesome. Love a live demo, and yeah, the profiler is awesome. And I'm sure one of our moderators will be putting that link in the Slack chat as well, so you can check out more. Now, let's hear from the aforementioned Lewis Ardern, who's going to be talking about a new VS Code plugin.
Yeah, it's a lot to say. Awesome. Let me just make sure that I have the right tabs open before I share my screen, because that would be not ideal. Cool. Okay, so cool. Can you? Okay, I'm assuming you can see my screen. So awesome. So I have used Semgrep for quite a while, and I would class myself as a pretty heavy power user of the product. I still spend a lot of time going, how does that pattern work again? Like, how does pattern inside work? Like, how many times can I use like pattern either, etc. No idea, so I have to go and take a look at the docs. And if you write a lot of rules, you come to the conclusion pretty quickly that you're like, hey, I would like to be able to do this pretty quickly, and the editor's improving, but it's still not quite there for all the things that I personally would want. So I was like, it would be pretty cool to, inside my editor, to have the capabilities to basically have the patterns that I need, on the go straight away, rather than like cloning a rule, modifying that particular rule. Just start from scratch every single time, have a pretty decent base pattern, and go from there. So that's what I did. I created a bunch of Semgrep snippets from scouring the rule syntax of semgrep.dev, taking a look at everything that is there, and finding the most, at least as a proof of concept, the most ones that I think would be useful for most people to use. So if we go over to my test, you can use Control Shift and P inside Visual Studio Code, at least on Windows, to install extensions. You can go in here, you can install the Semgrep snippet, which currently is version 5, because obviously we're all humans and make mistakes. So it's obviously got some small improvements over time. But let's take a look at, there's a few things that I really felt were needed for this particular stuff. So I had to write a lot of Java rules in my previous role. And I was like, you know what, why is this test failing? And it's because I messed up the syntax of the Java class. And I was like, okay, that should never happen. So lo and behold, I can now do semgrep-java, which creates a bunch of default syntax for this to start. And also, I had to write a lot of Golang too, so I can also do semgrep.go, and it creates a bunch of like initial scaffolding for the types of things that I would need to write a new rule. So going on from there, let's just take a very simple rule. So let's just call this RSA. We want to talk about some encryption for a second. We're going to import the actually we don't need import for this rule. So let's just say, we want to make sure that the key pair generator for crypto, let's just call it RSA, and then just call it, I can't remember the syntax, so I'm just going to call it good.getInstance, RSA. So lo and behold, you can create a rule like this to obviously, I'm writing the rule rather than actually writing the code. So let's just start again, and I'll just take a snippet from the internet. And so let's say we want to make a new rule of RSA. So let's just say, like, this is the syntax. We have a key pair generator. We get the instance of RSA, and we initialize with 512. If someone's working in cryptography, you know that 512 is bad practice these days. So lo and behold, we want to write a rule for that. So if we go over to the Semgrep YAML file now, we can obviously use a bunch of Semgrep initiators. So we can do ! Semgrep, and it gives you a bunch of stuff that I think would be useful. So we could start with a basic pattern, and it lo and behold gives you a generic pattern to start with. For like, we talked about taint mode. This gives you the starting taint mode as well. So it has a pattern source, the pattern sink, pattern sanitizer. And obviously there's other things which have been pretty important to have. So like meta variable pattern, and also things like, just a meta variable comparison. So I think the meta variable comparison is probably the best rule to write for this. So, we have a value which is 512, and we want to check to make sure it's less than 512. So we can go, hey, give me the meta variable comparison value, gives me a good starting place. So the pattern is going to be something like this. if I could spell, get instance, RSA, and that's wrong. That needs to go there. And because we're inside a expanded quote, you need the actual full syntax, otherwise it's going to fail. And then you can have things like, key dot, initialize dot bits. And then we can change the meta variable comparison value to be bits. We can change the value of the bits to be like, 512. We can obviously make sure that, it's less than, dollar bits, less than 512. And obviously that should then, hopefully create the rule that we're looking for. And obviously the rule ID needs to match as well. And that needs to be Java. But I think it's like a really good starting place for someone that needs to just get up and running straight away. If we run this, obviously don't shame me for my World of Warcraft choices. And if I run the test, hopefully it should pass. If it doesn't, I have a backup anyway. Running one rule, something happened with the error anyway, but this is what it should have looked like, just from a basic example, and it's the same thing that I had before. So, anyway, so, obviously I think this is a pretty good place. And if you get to the point where you're like, hey, I need to add some new metadata, I can also add Semgrep metadata, so I can automatically get that stuff back, which I think is very useful. And obviously we can, start to, as someone who gets more, used to using the framework, etc., and writing rules, I feel like this is going to be a good place to have a bunch of snippets that are very useful for creating rules very quickly. So that's it. Hopefully you like it. Obviously you can access it from the marketplace, and hopefully people find it useful.
Thank you, Lewis. That's awesome. I always applaud a live demo, and VS Code is, I love using VS Code and working with snippets. Speeds things up a lot. As Kathy mentioned in the chat, we are running over and we apologize. If you're able to stick around, Isaac will go over the roadmap and we'll answer any questions that you have. If not, we will be posting the entire recording of this and the slides in the Slack channel. And yes, thank you very much. But I'll hand it over to Isaac.
Great, thanks, Emily. Yeah, we're running over, so this will be a bit of a whirlwind, but I'll give you the TLDR up front. We're trying to support every programming language in the world and all the configuration languages, and be able to combine that with being able to target third-party dependencies. So think like a POM XML, right, or a package.json as well. We made Semgrep a lot faster, like 2 to 3x. We're adding a lot of really, really juicy PA features. And there's a lot of really good stuff, especially the interaction between the command line and the app, just getting deeper and better coming up. So on the languages side, like we had this is actually straight from the last meetup, a little bit of a philosophy intro, I guess, about our goal here, right? Like there's not just a world that maybe existed 10 or 15 years ago where there's a really homogeneous app that's composed of a single language. Most applications these days, it's not just a Java app, it's Java with Spring, running on Lambda, with some MailChimp and some Postgres. There's just a soup of languages that are involved in actually shipping and running an application. So Semgrep today supports about 24 languages at various levels. And actually, I was trying to run a poll. Did that post successfully, simple poll in the general channel? Kathy, if not, maybe you can help me. I'll send you the command that I was hoping to use, and you can get it out there. But we are taking votes on what language we should promote next, from the experimental tier to beta or GA. Current priorities are we're promoting Scala and Kotlin to GA. Dockerfile is going to beta. We have a bunch of community language contributions, which are awesome. We don't track the roadmap for them quite as much, but we know that they continue to progress. And Swift is probably the next language that is on the coming soon part of the list. We also know that there's a lot of people who have requested SQL, as well as improvements to C and C++, which actually the really biggest question there is your code really C or C++, or is it written in the C preprocessor, which is notoriously tricky for static analysis tools to deal with, especially ones that operate directly on unprocessed source. But in addition to languages, we are working on an experimental key that lets us target dependencies in addition to programming languages. So the goal here is to be able to say, hey, like, I would like to look for vulnerable third-party dependencies with Semgrep. So this is, we're kind of sharing this with the community, even though it's not something that is really fully baked yet, but we've gotten a lot of interest in it. You can see here in this example, what we're actually doing is we're combining a package version specifier saying that this specific version of the AWS CLI has this vulnerability. And we're anding that, a logical and, with some Semgrep patterns that are actually giving you a sense of whether the vulnerability is actually exploitable. So one of the things that a lot of people have told us is, I get so many false positive alerts from tools that are scanning third-party dependencies, especially. And we've gotten a lot of asks for, hey, could I write Semgrep rules that could, increase the precision and recall of those sorts of alerts? So, well, at least precision. Watch this space. There's going to be more coming here in the next couple of months. The next sections we talked about languages is keeping Semgrep developer first, making it super fast, work on an airplane, very understandable and debuggable, field native. So we actually had a crazy performance improvement from .82 looking back to .71. In fact, some of our benchmarks show that we are actually faster than some native language linters, which is kind of nuts. We had a goal of getting sub 500 milliseconds startup time for a single file. I think we actually got sub 100 millisecond startup time because there's now an RPC layer for Semgrep. If you've noticed that the playground and the editor are much faster, that's because that shipped in the background. And what's coming up here, we still want to make things work even better offline, maybe having a local rule cache, support a bunch of IDEs, make sure that runs can be fully deterministic via registry pinning. And the next section, so the fourth part here is, hey, we want to make it really easy to write static analysis. You shouldn't have to have a Iago level understanding and PhD of program analysis to be very effective with Semgrep. So here's a list of things that we've shipped since the last meetup. There's a lot. I'm not going to go over it in the sake of time, and you've heard about a little bit of it already. What we're doing right now is we really want to mature taint mode. We want to get to GA support for all the languages that we have. We want to have deeper integration in the registry from the CLI, so being able to search and discover rules from the command line experience. We've shipped recursive join mode. If you haven't seen join mode, it's a way to go across files in the open source Semgrep. So have rules that create virtual SQL tables from file A or query A and query B, and then actually join those, which actually puts Semgrep on par, I would say, with any traditional static analysis security testing tool. The rule syntax may be a bit more verbose, but the power that you need is fundamentally there. You heard Iago talking about symbolic propagation, so that's currently opt-in. We want to make that the default. We really want to make it easier to understand why a finding occurred. So sometimes Semgrep matches like a whole function or a whole class, but you actually only care about this specific name or meta variable inside that class. So there's a new operator that will be documented soon called focus meta variable, which will actually let you zoom in and be like, yeah, like we wanted to find this whole thing, but actually I only want you to report this specific range. And then I think the last thing, just for the interest of time, we mentioned this in the one of the Slack threads, but we're experimenting with some proprietary extensions that have been requested by customers who want to trade off analysis speed for depth. So the main note on this one, I guess, is that we are not going to bifurcate the syntax at all. So same Semgrep query, same rule syntax, nothing changes there. But if you're willing to spend more compute and more memory, there may be an extension to Semgrep that leverages that trade-off in order to give you more precision or recall, potentially going across files for those results. So message us if you want to learn more about that. And then on the app side, we shipped a whole bunch of stuff. You heard about a bunch of it already. Config auto is maybe the only one that wasn't explicitly mentioned. On the roadmap for the app, we really want to have better support for taint mode and debugging in the editor, right? So Semgrep is great when it works. When it doesn't work, it can be quite tricky to figure out why. With taint mode, that gets potentially even more complicated because there's so much more to reason about. We want to make it easy to contribute rules back to the registry from the web UI to capture like contributions from people who don't have the time to make a whole local based setup, as well as syncing with Git-based workflows for writing rules back to the web UI. We are working and I think are about to ship a workflow that lets you actually move rules from, oh, okay, this is audit, let's just show this to the security team, to well, let's show developers, but just in non-blocking comments on PRs, and then to, okay, like we're actually really confident that if we see this, it's really bad, we should block the PRs. And then we also need to come back and improve the first run experience, right? So we've just crossed over about 2,000 Semgrep rules. If you've got a couple projects, the matrix of that by 2,000 rules is a lot. So we want to make sure that the first scan experience gives you good results, not overwhelming, lots of actionable true positives in the initial scan experience. So that is the roadmap in a sub 9-minute nutshell. But yeah, thanks so much for sticking around, and always happy to chat and answer more questions here or on Slack.
Thanks, Isaac. At this point, I think if people are, we completely understand if you have other time constraints, but if you're willing to stick around, and I can turn it over to the moderators, and we can respond to a couple questions that were posted in the Slack. Or I can, let's see, I see, looks like Hamza has a question. Are we planning to implement tape mode across multiple files, not just for one? Oh yes, there was a lot of discussion about this in the Slack.
Yeah, so we are experimenting with doing that as part of a proprietary extension to Semgrep. We've been really forthright if you look at the messaging for the open source, that one of the big constraints that Semgrep has is that it only works on a single file. And so for the open source, I think that's going to remain true because it keeps it very performant and very clean. As you may know, it's a lot more work to start doing multi-file analysis. But if you have interest in that, please reach out to us and we can tell you a little bit more about the experimentation we're doing there.
Awesome. So let's see, are there moderators? Do we have any other particular questions that would benefit from discussion in the meeting?
I think rest of the questions are answered in the Slack channel.
Okay, great. Well, I say if anyone else has any other further questions, again, feel free to post them in the Slack. And we really appreciate you joining us today. And we look forward to working with you more and hearing more from you in the Slack channel and beyond. Thanks very much.